It says, "And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were sore afraid." Now, we read that all the time, but I've got to ask the question, why were they sore afraid? Well, let's find out. Notice the phrase, the glory of the Lord. The glory of the Lord always symbolized the presence of God. And at that time, manifestations of God were very rare. Now, the reason I bring that up is because in the early days of Israel, manifestations of God occurred quite frequently. In fact, if you remember, the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle. Look at Exodus chapter 40, verses 34 and 35, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. "Then the cloud covered the tent of the meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." They saw the presence of God enter the tabernacle, so they knew that the presence of God was in the Holy of Holies. The same glory appeared in the Temple of Solomon. Turn to 1 Kings chapter 8, verse number 11, because what happened in the tabernacle in the wilderness occurred also in the Temple of Solomon. Notice what it says in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 11. "And the priests could not perform their services because of the cloud." The very same thing that happened in the tabernacle. "For the glory of the Lord filled his temple." Again, they saw the presence of God enter the temple of Solomon, so they knew that God's presence was in the Holy of Holies. But Ezekiel saw the glory of the Lord depart from the temple of Solomon. Turn to Ezekiel chapter 10, verse number 4, and then we're going to jump down and we're going to read verses 18 through 19, because for so many years, the presence of God dwelt in the temple. And yet Ezekiel saw the presence of God leave the temple, not to come back for almost 500 years. So notice what it says. This is verse number 4, Ezekiel chapter 10. "Then the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple. The cloud filled the temple, and the court was full of the radiance of the glory of the Lord. Then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple, and it stopped above the cherubim. While I watched, the cherubim spread their wings and rose from the ground, and as they went, the wheels went with them. They stopped at the entrance to the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of God of Israel was above them." Now look at Ezekiel chapter 11, verses 22 through 23, because you're going to see that the glory of the Lord is going to depart. And no longer is the presence of God going to dwell in the temple of Solomon. Notice what it says. "Then the cherubim with the wheels behind them spread their wings, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. The glory of the Lord went up from within the city and stopped above the mountain east of it." In other words, it went to where the Mount of Olives was, and then it was gone. "And for more than 500 years, the nation of Israel had not seen the glory of the Lord." In other words, they hadn't seen or experienced the presence of God. Now, when the glory of the Lord reappears 500 years later, where would you think that it would appear? Well, you would think that it would appear in the temple, right? That's the logical answer. Yeah, but that's not where it appeared. The glory of the Lord, which symbolized the presence of God, didn't appear in the temple. The glory of the Lord wasn't revealed to the priest who ministered in the temple as in the past, but to the shepherds. In other words, God was revealing himself to the common man, and no one was more common than a shepherd. You see, in David's day, shepherding was an honorable occupation. In fact, when we think of shepherding, we think of people like Jacob. We think of people like David. And we think of shepherding as being something that was very well respected. And in David's day, it was. But after the Babylonian captivity, shepherding became despised by the religious leaders. And the reason shepherds were despised by the religious leaders was because they were considered to be unclean. And here's why shepherds were considered to be unclean. First of all, their job forced them to touch things that were considered to be unclean. They had to help their animals give birth. How many of you have ever had to help one of your animals give birth? Well, they had to do that, and they had to do that quite frequently. Not only that, but they had to build fires from dried dung because they pastured their flock in places that didn't really have any trees. In fact, I'm always amazed when people go over to Israel with me, or I'm with someone who's been to Israel for the first time. The thing that really jumps out at them is there's not many trees in Israel. You see orchards of olive trees, or you might be where they're watering and they have different types of plants and trees there. But the thing that really jumps out at you is Israel doesn't have many trees. But one of the reasons they don't have many trees is because during the time of the Ottoman Empire, the people were taxed according to how many trees they had on their property. So the majority of people cut down all the trees. But even if you went back to Jesus' time or you went back to David's time, what you would find is there weren't many trees in the land of Israel. And the trees that they had were used in order to build structures or to build tools. So you didn't really have a lot of sticks that were lying around, especially where the shepherds had to take their flocks. And so if you wanted to cook your meat or you wanted to stay warm at night, you had to build a fire. And what did you use? Dried animal dung. So you had to touch things that were considered to be unclean. Secondly, they were unable to keep the regular time of prayer or to wear the tefillin, better known as phylacteries. A phylactery was a small leather box containing verses from the Torah written on parchment. You strapped one on your left arm, you strapped one on your forehead, and you wore them during your prayer time. Here's a picture of a Jew wearing phylacteries. Notice that on top of his forehead, right underneath his prayer shawl. And then if you notice, he's wrapping it around his left arm. This goes back to the Torah, one of the things that they took literally. And so you would see Jews doing this, especially at the time of Jesus. But shepherds didn't have the ability to do this. Shepherds, because of their job, couldn't keep the prayer times. They couldn't just tune things out or leave the sheep unattended or the goats or what other animals that they had. And they couldn't wear the phylacteries. And there were numerous other ceremonial laws that their job forced them to omit. And on top of that, shepherds were also considered to be ignorant because they weren't schooled in the law. So for those reasons, shepherds were despised by the religious leaders. And every shepherd knew that they were on the bottom rung of the ladder in society. In fact, even they considered themselves to be unclean. So now can you see why they were so afraid? All of their life, they had been taught that they were unclean, that they weren't keeping the laws of God. And now, all of a sudden, the glory of the Lord appears unto them, and their first reaction must have been, oh no, God has appeared unto us in order to wipe us out because we're unclean, because we're not keeping the law. Why else would God appear unto us, the lowest class of people? And that's, I'm sure, what was running through their head. But instead of wiping them out, the angel said, fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. Now I want you to notice that. It's not to some people, it's to all people. Now, the best way to emphasize that this was for all people was to go to the poor, to those who were on the bottom rung of the ladder when it comes to society, to go to the least, to go to those who were despised, to the social outcast, to those who were considered to be unclean and to be ignorant, because that would truly emphasize the point that this tidings of great joy is for all people. Not just for the righteous people or the holy people, but for all people. And then he gave the shepherds a sign that blew their mind. Look at verse number 12. And this shall be a sign unto you. Who's he talking to? The shepherds. This isn't a sign unto us. This is a sign unto the shepherds and for us that are reading this so that we can put ourselves in the place of the shepherds. But notice this sign that was unto the shepherds. You shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. You see, the shepherds expected to see the baby born in lavish accommodations. But instead they found the child born in a courtyard filled with animals. They expected the baby to have the best amenities, but they found him lying in a manger. They expected to see the baby adorned in costly apparel, but they found him wrapped in swaddling clothes. And I can imagine those shepherds turning to each other in shock, thinking, my gosh, this child was born in the very same conditions that we were. This child is no different than us. I can see them thinking that. The Son of God, the Savior of the world, was born in the same poor, humble conditions that we were.